while we're gathering up here, I wanted to do a little kind of introduction, a little touch base, I guess, where we're at right now. So we've been going through this study one at a time, or one story, showing how Old Testament figures relate to Christ. And this was a concept I had a while ago. I've wanted to work on, and something we'd have to kind of self-teach through because there's not a right now media video on this, and we'd have to kind of figure it out. And I didn't fully understand it myself, so I was struggling. How do we communicate it and do this well? And all my fears were for naught, because it's going amazing, and everybody's really understood the assignment, captured it, and are just leaning in wonderfully. So the issue that keeps coming up is everyone's talking about, we could do a whole series on this one figure, on this one or this one character, right? We could just keep going and going. And I don't want to lose the momentum of what we're trying to do, this self-teaching, this learning for ourselves piece. So what we're going to do is, at the end of this, in 4 weeks, we're just going to start over. But we're going to teach at our tables. So everybody at their table will take a week, take one of these figures, do a little research, pull out 2, 3 kind of key points. You don't have to do a big teaching. We'll also have a little video to accompany it each week for new visitors, so if somebody walks in, they're not totally lost and confused about where we're at. But everybody will kind of take that turn. Some of our tables are bigger than 6, so share, whatever. But just keep going with this, trying to mine these nuggets of information out of what we're doing here with the Old Testament. So that's where we're going. I wanted to preface that a little bit. I won't be here next week, so wanted to make sure everybody kind of had that perspective as we're continuing through this series. And with that, I'll bring Steve up for Abraham.
Great. Now Chris realizes he didn't give me enough time. All right. So Chris gave several of us these assignments, and then we get on a Zoom call, and he says, okay, Steve, you got Abraham, and you've got about 10 or 12 minutes. I'm like, what? I can't summarize a DUI in under a half hour, but it just... So if you've got a work meeting before 9:30, you might as well just leave now. Anyway. And so Abraham's a pretty fascinating character in the Bible. So we started with, obviously Genesis starts with creation. You got a few chapters of, God did a few things, created a few things, it was good. All right, then you get Adam, right? And Jerry taught on Adam. Adam, created out of the dust, loses a rib, gets a wife, naked, bad fruit, not naked, and then has a rebellious son. Okay, so easy enough. Easy enough, right? You could do that in 10 or 12 minutes. And then Noah, a little thundercloud, a dinghy, a few pets, done, right? Okay. So Abraham is not that way. The guy lived to 175. I have a few things to talk about. All right, so Abraham's story picks up in Genesis 12, and it actually goes through Genesis 25. So there's a lot of discussion about Abraham's life in Genesis. It takes up a good chunk of the first book of the Bible, and there's a reason for that. He receives the call from God and a promise. He is what we call the father of God's chosen people, which becomes the nation of Israel. And he sets the groundwork for a lot of things going forward for the rest of the Old Testament, frankly. So, again, I don't know necessarily how to summarize that other than to give you a little bit of information about his life and then draw some parallels, like Chris was talking about how that foreshadows Jesus and salvation for the rest of us beyond God's chosen people, the Gentiles. All right, so the first 12 chapters of Genesis is really about creation, and I'll include Adam and Noah in the creation story in large part. Then the rest of Genesis is about God's and his chosen people. So if you want to think about God's relationship to the earth, his creation, and then now we're transitioning into God's relationship to man. Okay. All right. So let me give Abraham a little bit of street cred in the Bible here for a moment. Jesus in John 8:56 describes or makes a comment about Adam this way, and these are Jesus' actual words. So in your Bibles, think red. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. So Jesus had the opportunity to watch Abraham's life. Jesus existed before Abraham. And Abraham goes back a ways. So to put it into context, think about Jesus pre-existing Abraham, just not in humanly flesh at that point. Later, Paul describes Abraham, or makes this comment about Abraham in Romans. Paul called him the, quote, the spiritual father of those who have faith. And then obviously Abraham makes it into that hall of faith in Hebrews as one of the original founding fathers of those men who had exceptional faith and lived it out. All right, so let me do a quick run through or an overview of Abraham's life and the major events real quickly, so you have some context for those who haven't read Genesis 12 through 25 recently. I think it's a good reminder of just his path and how he got to that hall of faith status. So he's born a couple thousand years after Noah. To put it in the timeline of things. He grew up originally in Mesopotamia. He was described briefly as kind of a worshiper of idols in his early years. And then God came to him, and he revealed himself to Abraham, and Abraham believed immediately, and that becomes important in this story. He's 75 at the point that happens. And yes, he was called Abram at that time. I'm going to refer to him as Abraham because going back and forth in the names becomes tricky. But so at 75 years old, God comes to Abraham because he has identified Abraham as unusually righteous. The Bible doesn't tell us what it was about Abraham's first 75 years that made him that way or caused God to identify him over others, but God did. So God appears to him, and Abraham receives both an instruction from God and a promise from God. So let's break those two things down for a moment. The instruction is this. God tells Abraham, go to a land that I will show you. Ultimately, that becomes Canaan, i.e. Israel. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. And all of the families on earth will be blessed through you. So there's the ultimate prophecy, right? We are the recipients of that initial instruction and promise that God made to Abraham thousands of years ago. And so then what is Abraham's response to that instruction and promise? He departed from his present location as the Lord instructed. Now keep in mind, Abraham was already a wealthy man with a lot of land, a lot of livestock, big family at that point. He had already in many ways been blessed, but he was told to give all that up and just go, and he did. And he went without knowing where he was going, Hebrews tells us. And ultimately, it is that obedience, that promise of this specific piece of dirt in the Middle East that continues to shape our world today, doesn't it? I mean, you don't have to pay attention to current events too much to know that the Jews, the nation of Israel, has clung to that dirt with everything they've got, and it still causes tension, right? And this is the origin of that story. So he goes, and it's interesting because ultimately Romans, through Paul, describes Abraham as really the chief biblical example of a man who banked his entire future on God's promises. Paul says in Romans 4:21 that Abraham was, quote, fully convinced that God is able to do whatever he promises. And so later when God talks about Abraham and the other pillars of the faith, talk about Abraham, that's what they talk about, is that he just trusted God's promises. And so if there's probably anything that we want to take away from the example that Abraham sets for our own lives, that's probably it at the end of the day, is God has made promises to his people throughout time, and we are able and should and will benefit from banking on those promises. All right, so what happens then? He leaves where he presently was, starts heading toward the land that God had told them to head for. He leaves Haran, goes to Canaan, which is the land that God had promised. He later leaves Canaan during a famine and goes to Egypt. That may sound familiar, or certainly will sound familiar next week when Hayden talks about Jacob. And if you know the story of Jacob and Joseph and the famine and traveling to Egypt to get away from the famine. So there's some parallels here with Abraham. Abraham leaves Canaan because of this famine, goes to Egypt. There's some chaos that happens with the people in Egypt, especially as it relates to his wife, Sarah. God, again, while in Egypt, promises to give him the land of Canaan. He moves to Hebron and builds an altar to God. There he meets a prophet by the name of Melchizedek. Through Melchizedek, God promises Abraham that he will have a son and become the father of a great nation. That gets a little blurry because ultimately, as many of you know the story of Hagar and Sarah, things get there's a little bit of drama in the Abraham household for a while. If you don't know it, I'll summarize quickly. Hagar is an Egyptian slave of Abraham at the time. Sarah, his wife, convinces Abraham to sleep with Hagar so that Hagar can bear him a son, because Sarah is past childbearing years at that point. He does so. Hagar has a son named Ishmael. At that point is when God appears to Abraham again and changes his name and reaffirms his covenant with Abraham to make him a father of a multitude of nations and to give him the land of Canaan, where he was currently living, but he was living as a foreigner at that point. It's also at that point that God institutes through Abraham the mark of his covenant, i.e. circumcision. Abraham's 99 years old at this point in the story. God then promises to bless Ishmael, who is the son of Hagar, and reassures Abraham that Sarah would also give him a son, and that son will be named Isaac. That's when things go awry in Sodom and Gomorrah. You have that kind of whole story where Abraham, and this is a fascinating kind of part of this story, and consumes a whole chapter. Abraham is negotiating with God to save certain people in Sodom before he destroys it. And God is negotiating back in some ways. I won't get into the details. We could talk a whole session on that negotiation and what it says about the relationship and the closeness and the intimacy that Abraham felt with God, to be able to barter, so to speak, with the creator of the universe. But in any event, so Sodom and Gomorrah happens. Abraham saves his nephew Lot, if you know that story. And then at the age of 100, Isaac is born to Sarah, who's also very old, and again had been previously barren and is also well beyond childbearing years. And at that point, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. And then we get to arguably one of the more famous portions of the Genesis story of Abraham, and that is God's testing of Abraham's faith by ordering him to offer up his son Isaac as a sacrifice. And he takes him up to a place called the Mount of Moriah. That becomes important later, or there's at least a parallel there. And as Abraham is fully compliant and willing and is preparing to offer up his son Isaac as a sacrifice on this altar that God's instructing him to build and kill his son, God relents, if you want to use that phrase, and spares Isaac and says, because you were so obedient and willing and compliant with my commands and banking on my promises, as I mentioned before, I am going to substitute a ram for Isaac, and ultimately a ram is sacrificed in Isaac's place. Think symbolism there for a moment. We'll come back to that. And at that point, God reaffirms his commitment to Abraham to bless all the nations of the earth through Abraham's descendants. Again, keep that in mind as we go forward too. Then Sarah dies. She dies at the age of 127. Abraham finds Isaac a wife, and then Abraham dies at 175. So we're talking about a 100-year stretch, a century of time, starting at age 75 when he receives that initial promise from God, to 175 when Abraham ultimately passes. More than any other Old Testament figure, Abraham shows us what a life of faith looks like. Paul says that when we live by faith, we, quote, share the same blessing Abraham did because of his faith. And that's Galatians 3:9. All right, so as Chris talked about, one of the things that we're trying to do in this series is draw out these parallels or point to how it is that these Old Testament characters foreshadow salvation through Christ, not only to the nation of Israel, but to the Gentiles as well. So I would point out three ways in which the life of Abraham pointed to the life, mission, and message of Jesus. First, Abraham's call is a picture of faith and obedience. God called, Abraham left everything, and based on his faith in God's plans, left comfort to become a blessing to everyone else. When I say everyone else, we mean everyone else. Not just his family, not just to his neighbors, but he was tasked with becoming God's conduit through which he was going to build this special relationship with man, his special creation. Abraham's journey also mirrors the mission of Jesus. He left his home and obeyed his father and his father's call in perfect trust. Jesus could have stayed the path of the carpenter life, right? Nazareth, hang out, have a family, be nice to your neighbors. He stretched. When he was called by God to a different path, He just went. Romans 4:3 says, quote, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Similarly, Christ's example confirmed the truth of this time-tested principle. Salvation has always been this formula: by God's grace through our faith. And both Abraham and Christ lived that and presented it to the rest of us. We also have the parallel of Isaac as a type of Christ. Isaac's birth was a miracle, as was Christ's. And God told the father, in this case Abraham, to climb Mount Moriah, which ultimately becomes the Temple Mount in Jerusalem later. Climb Mount Moriah, sacrifice your beloved son, this special son that was born of God, and only to be substituted by a sacrificed lamb, i.e., the perfect lamb. That offers us a clear picture of the ultimate Father who sacrificed his beloved Son, Jesus, who was a substitute for us, which took place a couple thousand years later on the same Mount Moriah, which is where Solomon built the first temple and close to the actual hill where Jesus was crucified. Then finally, that third parallel is, as Abraham was a blessing to all of the nations and every human being that would come after him, that ultimate promise was fulfilled in Christ. God tells Abraham in Genesis 12:3, quote, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Kind of a weird promise at the time. How do you make sense of that? Then in Galatians, after the fact, Paul's writing to the Galatians in 3:16, and he brings it home saying, quote, the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, meaning one person who is Christ, end quote. So ultimately, Paul is tying up this promise made to Abraham in Genesis way back in Galatians. Jesus is the seed of Abraham. In other words, the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise. So in other words, Abraham's life was a divine preview of the gospel, from the initial promise to the final blessing. So I think we then have to kind of come back to the question that Chris gave us from the beginning. And when he asked us to draw these parallels between these Old Testament characters and the fulfillment of these promises through Jesus. And we have to ask the question of, why is the fact that so many of these Old Testament characters and these Old Testament stories, why is the fact that they offer a foreshadowing of the coming salvation of humanity through Jesus, why is that important? Why did he engage in this foreshadowing? What is the significance of this foreshadowing? One, I think it shows a couple things. But first of all, it talks to us, should speak to us about the unity of the Bible, and therefore gives us support to its credibility as the written story of God's creation and his relationship with man from the beginning to the end. And that story is one of consistency and logic and coherency. It's not just a bunch of separate books written by separate men at different times that may give us some good moral principles. It is God's story from beginning to end that has continuity to it. And in that continuity comes credibility. It also provides support for the conclusion that Jesus was and is the Messiah that has always been promised, and that he existed from the beginning. And finally, it demonstrates, probably most of all, God's sovereignty and faithfulness through the ages. That consistency of God's character. Who he was in Genesis is who he was when he put his son on that cross at Calvary, right? It's the same God. And he always has had that same perspective on his relationship with his creation, man. So it establishes his consistency of character across history, despite what so many people say about, oh, the God of the Old Testament is more wrathful or angry than the God of the New Testament, and they describe two different gods. These parallels show that to be incorrect. How has he dealt with his creation of man over time may change in certain circumstances, but his character has always remained the same, that he wanted to bless his creation. And it also establishes the depth of his commitment to that relationship with man. He never gave up on us. He made his commitments to Abraham. He made his commitments to his son. He still makes his commitments to us. And we can bank on those promises. So Christianity, us, is the continuation, not the rejection of the story of Israel. And that all started with Abraham. And so, therefore, it's important for us to understand who he was, what he did, and how that translates into the life that we live now, and how and the interplay that we can still have with his promises to the forefathers, so to speak. Thanks, guys. Chris, I have no idea if I went way over that or not.